They said it was impossible. That Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer in history, had died on a hot August night in 1977. His body was buried, his legacy sealed. And yet the whispers never stopped. Whispers that maybe, just maybe, the king of rock and roll hadn't left us at all. That somewhere in some quiet corner of America, he was living a different life, one away from the spotlight. And then came the moment that seemed to turn rumor into reality. The moment they put Elvis Presley beside Pastor Bob Joyce. Phones were raised, people leaned forward in disbelief. The voice, the face, the presence. What happened next stunned the world, and for millions it forced the question all over again. Did Elvis Presley truly leave us, or had he been standing in plain sight all along? But to understand why this moment carries such weight, why it ignited both tears and fury, belief and denial, we need to go back. Back to who Elvis was in his final years. Back to the man who became Pastor Bob Joyce. And back to the mysterious parallels that continue to blur the line between faith, legend, and identity. This isn't just a story about celebrity, it's about why people cling to legends, why we find comfort in believing that the ones we love most are never really gone, and why, when Elvis was placed beside Pastor Bob Joyce, the reaction became more than just about two men. It became about the power of memory, hope, and the mysteries we still can't let go of. For most people, Elvis Presley is a name carved into history. He was the boy from Tupelo who rose from nothing, who revolutionized music, who became the cultural icon of the 20th century. His voice carried joy and heartbreak in equal measure. His presence electrified millions. And yet, for all the fame and fortune, Elvis carried a loneliness that very few understood. In the last years of his life, he struggled. Fame weighed on him. The endless tour, the scrutiny, the pressure to always be Elvis, drained him of the simple man he once was. When he passed in 1977, it felt like the world lost more than just a singer. It felt like the end of an era, the silencing of a spirit that had touched lives far beyond music. But almost immediately, the questions began. Fans refused to believe it, reports surfaced of sightings. Conspiracies grew, fueled by inconsistencies in the reports of his death. And for decades, one question refused to die: could Elvis still be alive? Most dismissed it as wishful thinking, but then came a man named Bob Joyce. In Benton, Arkansas, far away from the flashing lights of Las Vegas or the Graceland gates, Pastor Bob Joyce quietly built a ministry. To his congregation, he was a man of faith, humility, and compassion. But to anyone who had ever listened to Elvis Presley, something didn't sit quietly at all. It was the voice, that unmistakable baritone. The same richness, the same power, the same inflections that had once filled stadiums and shook the walls of gospel churches. Listeners described it as uncanny, almost eerie, like hearing Elvis sing again. And then there was his appearance. The same piercing eyes, the same smile, even his mannerisms seemed to echo the king. For those who had spent their lives idolizing Elvis, the similarities were simply too much to ignore. Online forums exploded. Videos of Pastor Joyce's sermons went viral. Comment sections filled with arguments, some swearing it was Elvis, others calling it ridiculous. News outlets began picking up the story, fanning the flames further, and with every passing year, the comparisons only grew louder. It might have stayed just an internet curiosity, another strange conspiracy, if not for one extraordinary moment. The moment when, whether by fate or by design, Elvis Presley was placed beside Pastor Bob Joyce. It wasn't just a side-by-side photo or an online edit. It was live, real, a collision of legend and reality. The reactions ranged from laughter to tears, from shock to worship, but nobody left untouched. And that is why this story matters, because at its core, it isn't really about proving whether Bob Joyce is Elvis. It's about why so many people want it to be true. We live in a world that loses its heroes too soon. Legends like Elvis burn brightly, then vanish before we're ready to say goodbye. And when that happens, something inside us resists. We refuse to let go. We search for signs, for echoes, for continuations of their spirit. Pastor Bob Joyce, whether he is or isn't Elvis, became that echo. He became the living reminder of a man we never wanted to lose. This is a story of faith colliding with fame, of music blending into ministry, and of how a single moment, Elvis beside Pastor Bob Joyce, reignited one of the greatest mysteries of modern culture. It's a story of memory, hope, and why legends never truly die. To understand why people gasped when Elvis Presley was placed beside Pastor Bob Joyce, we have to go back. Back to the man Elvis truly was in his final years, and the world into which Pastor Bob Joyce would later step. Only then can we understand why these two names would become bound together in one of the most mysterious and emotional stories of modern times. Elvis Presley was never just an entertainer. By the mid-1970s, he had become something larger than life. To fans, he wasn't simply a singer, he was a myth, a symbol, a kind of cultural miracle who had risen from poverty to rule the world stage. But the higher Elvis climbed, the heavier the crown became. Fame, once intoxicating, turned suffocating. The boy from Tupelo, who had once dreamed only of gospel harmony and a better life for his mama, now lived inside a gilded prison called Graceland. By 1976 and 1977, his world had narrowed. The stage lights still burned, but his health faltered. Night after night, he poured out what strength remained into his performances, often staggering off stage only to prepare for the next show. The tabloids feasted on his decline, painting him as broken, fragile, even grotesque. But those who knew him best saw something else, a man searching for peace, for meaning, for God. Elvis had always carried faith deep inside him. Long before the rhinestone jumpsuits, he was the boy who sang hymns with his mother, who clung to gospel music as the truest form of expression. Even at the height of fame, he turned again and again to gospel songs, recording them not for profit but for his soul. By the end of his life, faith was no longer just a comfort, it was a lifeline. And then suddenly it was gone, or so the world was told. On August 16, 1977, the news rang out. Elvis Presley was dead. He was only 42. The world staggered. Fans wept in the streets. Thousands poured into Memphis, desperate for one last glimpse, one last touch of the man who had defined an era. But almost immediately, something strange happened. Whispers began. Some said they saw him days later boarding a plane under a false name. Others swore they caught a glimpse of him in the crowd at Graceland, alive and well. Conspiracies spread like wildfire, that Elvis had faked his death to escape fame, that he had retreated into a quiet life of faith, that he was hiding in plain sight. The more the official story was repeated, the more people clung to their doubts. At first, these were dismissed as desperate delusions, the kind of fantasies grieving fans invent to soften their loss. But then came the voice. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new name began to circulate in small circles of believers, Bob Joyce. A preacher in Benton, Arkansas, Joyce built a ministry grounded in faith and humility. He wasn't seeking fame, wasn't chasing headlines. He stood at his pulpit and preached the gospel. He sang hymns with a power that shook his congregation to tears. And then someone somewhere said it aloud. He sounds exactly like Elvis Presley. At first, it was brushed aside as coincidence. After all, Elvis's voice was iconic, but voices can be similar. But then recordings of Pastor Bob's singing began to spread. People leaned closer. The deep baritone, the rich timbre, the emotional phrasing, it wasn't just similar. It was uncanny. It was as if Elvis himself was singing again, pouring out the same gospel fire that had once filled cathedrals and arenas alike. It wasn't just the voice. People noticed his appearance. The eyes sharp, piercing, familiar. The smile warm but hauntingly recognizable. Even his mannerisms, the way he carried himself, the way he moved when he sang, sparked instant déjà vu. Soon the comparisons exploded. Videos of Pastor Joyce singing circulated online and the comments filled with disbelief. This is Elvis. That voice, there's no way it isn't him. I thought Elvis was gone, but here he is praising the Lord. The more attention grew, the more polarizing the story became. Some fans swore the resemblance was undeniable. Others scoffed, calling it disrespectful, even blasphemous, to suggest Elvis Presley lived on under another name. But the whispers refused to die. And maybe it wasn't just about resemblance. It was about longing. The world had lost Elvis too soon. For many, his death was more than a personal heartbreak. It was the end of an era, the silencing of a voice that had carried their youth, their joy, their first loves, their heartbreaks. To imagine he might still be alive, still singing, still praising God in some small-town church, it gave people hope. By the 2000s, the theory had taken on a life of its own. Entire communities formed online, dedicated to studying photos, analyzing audio, comparing every detail of Pastor Joyce to Elvis Presley. They scrutinized sermons frame by frame, slowed down recordings, and posted side-by-side pictures. Some claimed undeniable proof. Others insisted it was madness. But whether you believed it or not, one truth was undeniable. Pastor Bob Joyce had become the focal point of one of the greatest what-ifs in modern history. He had become, willingly or not, the living echo of Elvis Presley. And through it all, Pastor Bob remained grounded. He never stepped into the spotlight to exploit the speculation. He never sold himself as Elvis returned. He preached, he sang, he ministered to his flock, and perhaps that only deepened the mystery. For those who believed, his humility was proof. Only Elvis would want to turn away from fame to serve God, they said. For skeptics, his silence was evidence of nothing more than coincidence. Still, the tension built. Decades after Elvis's death, the story refused to fade. Every time Pastor Joyce sang, the debate reignited. Was this simply a preacher with a remarkable voice, or the king himself, reborn in a different calling? And then, finally, came the moment that would tip this story from whispers into spectacle. The moment when, in front of cameras and eyes around the world, Elvis Presley was placed beside Pastor Bob Joyce. But before we can step into that extraordinary moment, one thing must be understood. This was never just about whether a man could fake his death. It was about the hunger we all share to keep our heroes alive. To believe that somewhere, somehow, they're still out there, still singing, still reminding us of who we are and what we've lost. Because when Pastor Bob Joyce opened his mouth and that voice came out, it didn't matter whether you believed he was Elvis or not. What mattered was how it made people feel. For some, it was comfort. For others, it was shock. For many, it was goosebumps, the sound of a legend echoing through time, refusing to die. And that is why the world leaned forward. That is why cameras shook, why fans wept, why skeptics clenched their jaws. Because if Elvis Presley was truly gone, then how could Pastor Bob Joyce sound so achingly familiar? The whispers that began in 1977 had now roared into a storm. And as the two figures, Elvis Presley and Pastor Bob Joyce, were finally placed side by side, the world braced itself for the answer to a question it had been asking for nearly half a century. The rumors had stretched for decades, but now they were no longer confined to hushed whispers or late-night conversations among fans. By the time Pastor Bob Joyce's name was firmly linked with Elvis Presley, curiosity had snowballed into a worldwide obsession. And with every passing year, the tension only grew. People didn't just wonder anymore, they demanded answers. It began innocently enough. A fan would stumble across one of Pastor Joyce's sermons online, pause mid-scroll and freeze. That voice, that tone, it wasn't just similar, it was unmistakable. They'd play it again, rewinding the hymn or sermon clip, goosebumps crawling up their arms. Soon they were sharing it with friends. Listen to this, doesn't that sound exactly like Elvis? And with each share, the question spread further. Comment sections lit up. Conspiracy forums buzzed. Videos of Pastor Joyce singing racked up hundreds of thousands of views. And always beneath every video, the same debate raged. Was this man simply a preacher with an extraordinary gift, or had Elvis Presley found his way back through him? As speculation swelled, the story began to spill into mainstream attention. Newspapers ran features. Television segments invited experts to weigh in. Vocal coaches compared the two voices side by side, and many admitted the resemblance was uncanny. Side-by-side photographs circulated. The same sharp blue eyes, the same jawline softened with age, the same hairline familiar beneath the years. The louder the story became, the more divided people grew. For the faithful, this was validation. See, we weren't crazy. Elvis is alive and he's chosen to serve God. For skeptics, it was dangerous delusion, the kind of myth-making that turned grief into fantasy. But both sides were united in one thing: they couldn't look away. And then, everything pointed toward one extraordinary gathering. It was a Sunday unlike any other. Pastor Bob Joyce was scheduled to deliver a sermon, and the buzz around it had reached a fever pitch. Whispers spread that something unusual was going to happen. Some claimed insiders had confirmed it, that Elvis Presley would in some way be placed beside Bob Joyce. Whether it would be a comparison, a photo, or something more, nobody knew. But everyone felt the same electricity: a collision was coming. That morning, the small church felt nothing like a humble house of worship. The parking lot overflowed with cars from neighboring states. Strangers lined the sidewalks, clutching old vinyl records, worn photographs, and Bibles alike. Some wore Elvis t-shirts, others came dressed for church as though to prove their faith outweighed their curiosity. Inside, the pews filled quickly. Elderly fans who had seen Elvis in his glory days sat shoulder to shoulder with teenagers who had discovered him only through YouTube clips. The air buzzed with anticipation. Conversations whispered through the crowd. What if it really is him? Do you think he'll admit it? Maybe today's the day. And beneath those whispers lay an even deeper current: fear. Fear of being let down. Fear of discovering it was only a resemblance, only coincidence, nothing more. Nobody said it aloud, but the question hung heavy. What if this moment shattered the illusion once and for all? As the clock ticked closer to the service, the tension became almost unbearable. Camera phones hovered in shaky hands. Every cough, every shuffle of shoes against the floor sounded magnified in the silence of waiting. Finally, the music began. Pastor Bob Joyce stepped forward. His presence was calm, but the reaction wasn't. Gasps rippled through the crowd. To those who had spent years poring over every detail, the sight of him in person was overwhelming. The same height, the same posture. And when he opened his mouth to greet the congregation, the room seemed to freeze. That voice, deep, rich, familiar in a way that cut straight through decades of absence. Some people wept instantly. Others gripped their seats, refusing to blink. Even skeptics felt a tremor in their chest. It was impossible not to. For a moment, the line between past and present blurred. But the real crescendo hadn't yet arrived. Midway through, the long-awaited comparison was finally presented. Whether by design or divine coincidence, the moment people had speculated about for years unfolded before their eyes. Elvis Presley placed side by side with Pastor Bob Joyce. At first, it was almost surreal. A screen flickered, showing archival footage of Elvis, young, vibrant, commanding the stage with his gospel fire. And beside it stood Pastor Bob Joyce, living, breathing, singing with the same fire decades later. The juxtaposition was jarring, two faces, two voices, one living echo of the other. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. People gasped audibly. Some clutched their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. Tears streamed down faces young and old. In that moment, it didn't matter whether you believed Elvis had faked his death or whether you thought Bob Joyce was simply a remarkable lookalike. What mattered was the feeling, as if Elvis himself had returned. The song swelled, voices joined in. For a few moments it felt as though time itself had folded, bringing two worlds together. Fans who had mourned Elvis for decades felt something ignite: hope, longing, joy, grief, all tangled together. And yet, beneath the beauty of that moment, tension remained. Skeptics crossed their arms, whispering accusations of trickery. Believers leaned forward, pointing at the screen, whispering, "Look at him, listen to him, that Elvis, it has to be." No matter which side you stood on, you couldn't deny it. History had been made. A decades-long debate had been brought to life before everyone's eyes. And yet, the answers still weren't clear. Because when the music ended and the screen went dark, Pastor Bob Joyce didn't make a dramatic announcement. He didn't confirm the rumors or deny them. He simply folded his hands, bowed his head, and continued his sermon. Calm, steady, focused not on himself but on God. The crowd leaned forward, almost begging for more. Was he going to acknowledge it? Was he going to admit something, anything? But Pastor Bob carried on, never feeding the frenzy. That perhaps only deepened the mystery. For believers, his silence was confirmation. Of course he won't admit it. Elvis wanted peace. He wanted to live for God. This proves it. For skeptics, it was the opposite. See, he's not Elvis. He's just a man doing his job. But no one left that church untouched. No one forgot the moment Elvis Presley and Pastor Bob Joyce were placed side by side. It wasn't just the shock of resemblance. It wasn't just the haunting sound of a voice that refused to die. It was the way it made people feel, as though the king had stepped out of history for a brief moment, not to bask in fame, but to remind the world of something deeper. And as the congregation filed out, their emotions in turmoil, the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder. Did you see his eyes? Did you hear that note? I swear that was Elvis. The tension that had built for decades had reached its breaking point. The collision had happened. And yet, instead of ending the debate, it had only fueled it. Because if Elvis Presley was truly gone, then what had they just witnessed? The moment had been building for decades: whispered rumors, grainy comparisons, online debates that stretched across continents. But now all of it crystallized into one breathless instant. The lights dimmed, the room fell still, and suddenly the world's most enduring question stood right before their eyes: Elvis Presley beside Pastor Bob Joyce. At first, there was silence. A silence so sharp it almost hummed, broken only by the faint crackle of audio as Elvis's younger voice filled the speakers. Archival footage flashed: the king in his prime, draped in white, singing gospel with every ounce of his soul. The sound rolled through the room, familiar and haunting, a voice that had once defined a generation. And then, almost seamlessly, the voice of Pastor Bob Joyce joined it. No studio tricks, no gimmicks, just a living man standing before them, singing with that same thunderous resonance. The effect was staggering. The voices merged in a way that defied time itself, as though the past and the present had collided, as though Elvis had never left at all. The congregation gasped as one. Some covered their mouths, trembling. Others clutched the hands of those beside them, unable to look away. One elderly woman, her hair white and her hands shaking, whispered through tears, "That's him, my God, that's him." The comparison wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't just an online video or a blurry photo. It was happening in real time, in front of eyes that could hardly process what they were seeing. Two faces, two voices, impossibly intertwined. The footage of Elvis showed him closing his eyes, lost in the music. At the same moment, Pastor Bob Joyce did the same. Their expressions matched like reflections, brows furrowed with passion, lips trembling with conviction, hands lifting as if carried by the same unseen spirit. The crowd couldn't decide if they were watching two men or one. And then came the breaking points. The song rose, its final chorus swelling to a near unbearable pitch. The footage of Elvis soared, his voice filling the space like it had once filled arenas. But as it faded, Pastor Bob carried it forward, the same notes, the same phrasing, the same fire, extended beyond what the recording could hold. It was as if the torch had passed mid-song, Elvis handing over his voice to the man beside him. For the crowd, it was too much. Tears streamed openly. Some fell to their knees, overcome by the raw power of what they were experiencing. Others shouted "Amen," or simply wept silently, shaking their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just music anymore, it was resurrection. The tension that had been mounting for years erupted all at once. For believers, it was confirmation. How else could anyone explain it? How could two voices, two presences be so perfectly aligned? Skeptics tried to cling to logic, whispering explanations, genetics, coincidence, mimicry. but their words felt hollow in the face of what everyone had just felt in their bones. Because what happened in that room wasn't an argument, it was an experience. Even the skeptics fell silent as Pastor Bob's voice thundered in the final notes. His chest rose and fell, his eyes glistening, and for a moment the resemblance was undeniable. Elvis Presley, or the living echo of him, stood in the flesh, commanding the room with a presence too familiar to dismiss. The air itself seemed charged, thick with energy. You could almost feel the weight of history pressing down, demanding to be acknowledged. For those who had lost Elvis in 1977, it was as if the wound had cracked open again, not in grief but in awe. And then came the pause. The music stopped, the screen went dark. Only Pastor Bob remained, his voice still echoing in the hearts of everyone present. He lowered the microphone slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. Dozens leaned forward, desperate for a word, a hint, some acknowledgement of what had just unfolded. The anticipation was unbearable. But Pastor Bob didn't claim anything. He didn't confirm, he didn't deny. He simply nodded, bowed his head, and spoke words of faith, not about himself, not about Elvis, but about God. The restraint only deepened the mystery. If he were an imposter, surely he would leap at the fame. If he were Elvis, surely the temptation to reveal himself would be overwhelming. But instead there was only humility, only reverence, only the calm insistence that the focus remain not on the man but on the message. The crowd erupted anyway. Some clapped wildly, unable to contain their emotions. Others wept openly, convinced they had just witnessed a miracle. Phones buzzed as clips were shared online, spreading instantly across the globe. Within hours, headlines erupted. The voice of Elvis lives on. Pastor or Presley, the mystery deepens. But inside that church, the frenzy of the outside world didn't matter. What mattered was the electricity that had just passed through every soul in attendance. One man later described it like this. It was as if the curtain between heaven and earth had been pulled back. Whether it was Elvis or not, it felt like the king's spirit was alive in that room. For others, it was more personal. A woman who had been a teenage fan in the 1950s said it felt like closure. We never got to say goodbye properly. That day, it felt like he came back to let us know he was all right. The duality of the moment was staggering. On one side, a man of God, humble and steady, simply living his calling. On the other, the unmistakable ghost of Elvis Presley, not in theory, not in memory, but alive in voice, in presence, in power. And that duality created something no one could have predicted: unity. For one brief instant, skeptics and believers, the faithful and the doubtful, were united in awe. They might have left divided in their conclusions, but during those minutes they were all witnesses to something that defied explanation. That was the turning point, not just for the legend of Elvis Presley, but for the story of Bob Joyce. Because from that moment on, it was no longer possible to separate the two. The resemblance had moved beyond rumor, beyond online debate. It had been lived, felt, and burned into memory. And yet, as powerful as the moment was, it left the most important question unanswered. If Elvis Presley had truly left the world in 1977, how could this man stand before them now, carrying his voice like a living torch? And if Pastor Bob Joyce was not Elvis, then why did so many leave that church convinced they had just encountered him? The line between legend and reality had blurred into something neither side could explain away. And the story, instead of ending, had only just begun. The moment ended, but the echoes lingered. For those who sat in that church, the memory clung to them like perfume on clothing. Days later, they could still hear the voice, still see the uncanny resemblance, still feel the hair rise on their arms when Elvis Presley and Pastor Bob Joyce had seemed, for one extraordinary instant, to be the same. But what happened next may have been just as powerful as the moment itself. Because the world did what it always does when faced with the unexplained. It argued, it divided, and it sought answers. Within hours, clips of the event spread online like wildfire. Social media timelines filled with shaky footage, captions screaming in disbelief. "It's Elvis. He's alive. This proves it." Fans who had been children in the 1950s wept as they replayed the video. Teenagers who had never lived in Elvis's era sat stunned, realizing they were witnessing not just history but mystery. Mainstream outlets caught wind quickly. News anchors debated it on air, playing snippets of Elvis and Bob Joyce back to back. Vocal analysts dissected the recordings, pointing out identical phrasing, breath control, even quirks in tone that seemed too precise to be coincidence. Psychologists weighed in, explaining why people cling to the idea of lost legends still living. And theologians were asked whether such uncanny resemblances might be divine rather than human. And yet, for every believer swept up in awe, there was a skeptic waiting to push back. They pointed to science, to probability, to the fact that many people in history had similar voices. This is no different than a tribute act, they argued. Resemblance does not equal resurrection. But skeptics underestimated one thing: the emotional impact of what had been experienced in that room. Because those who were there didn't just hear a voice or see a resemblance, they felt something. They felt the weight of history collapse into the present. They felt a longing decades deep, answered in a way they hadn't thought possible. And feelings, once ignited, are nearly impossible to erase with logic. Even outside the church, people described strange emotions. One man said watching the footage made him cry without knowing why. Another confessed he felt goosebumps as though his father, a lifelong Elvis fan who had passed years ago, was somehow reaching back through the screen. These weren't casual reactions. They were deeply personal, intimate, almost spiritual. And that may have been the most stunning consequence of all. For Pastor Bob Joyce, the comparisons could have been a burden. He could have stepped forward, denying everything, insisting once and for all that he was not Elvis Presley. He could have scolded his followers for worshiping a myth instead of focusing on God. But he didn't. Instead, Pastor Bob remained steady, calm, and unwavering in his mission. He never publicly confirmed the rumors. He never fueled the fire, but neither did he run from it. He allowed people to feel what they felt, to believe what they believed, while always steering their focus back to faith. The music, he once said, is only a vessel. It's the message that matters. This refusal to address the speculation directly only intensified it. For some, his silence was proof. If he was Elvis, he'd say so, they argued. For others, his humility was simply that of a preacher who didn't want distractions. But for everyone, the mystery deepened. The media, hungry for headlines, pressed harder. Documentaries popped up, stitching together side-by-side footage, interviews with fans, even supposed insiders who claimed to know the truth. Some said Elvis had always longed to escape fame, and this was his way of returning to the life he wanted most, a life of music and ministry, stripped of stage lights and screaming fans. Others argued that the world's refusal to let Elvis die said more about us than it did about him. And maybe that was the hidden truth revealed in the aftermath. Because beneath the arguments, beneath the debates, beneath the shaky phone recordings played millions of times, one fact remained: people didn't want Elvis Presley to be gone. They wanted to believe in second chances. They wanted to believe that a man crushed by fame could find peace. They wanted to believe that even legends could be reborn not as icons but as men of God. In that sense, it didn't matter whether Pastor Bob Joyce was Elvis Presley or not. The impact was the same. He had become a vessel for people's longing, their hope, their grief, and their belief that legacies never truly die. The event left scars and blessings in equal measure. For some fans, it was liberation, proof they had always been right, vindication for decades of whispers dismissed as nonsense. For others, it was a cruel trick of coincidence, a reminder of just how much people still ache for Elvis. For Pastor Bob himself, it was both an opportunity and a burden, to carry not just his own message of faith but also the weight of a legend people refused to bury. But perhaps the most profound consequence was the shift in perspective it created. Suddenly, Elvis Presley's story wasn't just about a man who rose to fame and died too young. It was about transformation. It was about how the spirit of a person can live on, whether in another man's voice or in the memory carried by millions. People left that church service different than when they walked in. They left wrestling with questions bigger than Elvis or Bob Joyce. Questions about identity, about faith, about why we cling so fiercely to our heroes. One woman described it best when she said, "Maybe it doesn't matter if Pastor Bob is Elvis. Maybe what matters is that for a moment we felt him again. We felt what it was like to believe." And that belief, fragile yet powerful, spread across the world like wildfire. It is rare for a single moment to ripple across generations, but this one did. It forced people to reflect not just on Elvis Presley's legacy, but on their own need for hope, their own hunger for something larger than life. And as Pastor Bob Joyce continued his work, preaching, singing, serving, the questions never stopped. But neither did the impact. Whether he was Elvis Presley or not, he had brought millions back to a place they thought they had lost forever: the sound, the feeling, the soul of the King. The aftermath proved one thing beyond doubt: Elvis Presley's story was not finished. And as the world debated, argued, and speculated, a larger truth began to emerge. Maybe the real miracle wasn't whether Elvis had faked his death. Maybe the real miracle was how one man's voice, echoing through another's, had reignited the spirit of millions. Time has a way of softening legends, but not this one. Decades after Elvis Presley's death, the moment when he was placed beside Pastor Bob Joyce continues to stir hearts, ignite debates, and spark a sense of wonder that refuses to fade. The world has moved on in countless ways: new stars, new scandals, new distractions, but still, the mystery of Elvis lingers, and Pastor Bob stands at the center of it. The legacy of that moment isn't written in headlines or news cycles. It lives in the personal stories of those who experienced it, in the quiet reflections of fans, in the ways people still whisper his name as though he were alive. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing: Elvis Presley never truly died, not in spirit, not in memory, not in voice. For those who believe Pastor Bob Joyce is Elvis, the legacy feels almost divine. To them, it proves that the king was granted a second chance not to dominate arenas but to shepherd souls. What better redemption for a man who once felt imprisoned by fame than to return as a preacher, his gift repurposed for faith? To these believers, Pastor Bob embodies the greatest transformation imaginable, the icon of excess reborn as a servant of God. And every time he sings, they hear not just music, but proof that miracles walk among us. For skeptics, the legacy lies elsewhere. They see in this story a lesson about longing, about how desperately people want their heroes back. To them, Pastor Bob Joyce is a mirror reflecting our collective inability to let go. Elvis was more than a singer, he was a symbol of hope, rebellion, love, and loss. Losing him felt like losing a piece of ourselves. And so, when a man appeared with his voice, his look, his manner, we clung to it. Not because it was true, but because it felt true. But whether you are a believer or a skeptic, the effect is undeniable. The mystery has kept Elvis alive in ways no tribute act, no statue, no museum ever could. It has made people listen to his music again, watch his films again, talk about his legacy again. It has brought him back into the conversation not as a relic of the past, but as a living question mark. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, the conversation itself, because in that conversation lies something deeper than Elvis or Bob Joyce. It is the conversation about why we need legends, why we hold on to them, why we refuse to let their light fade even when the world insists it has gone dark. Legends are not just people, they are mirrors. We see in them our own dreams, our own struggles, our own search for meaning. When they fall, we fall with them. When they rise, we rise too. And when they vanish too soon, we feel abandoned, left to carry their flame alone. But when a story like Pastor Bob Joyce's appears, it reminds us that maybe the flame was never extinguished. Maybe it just changed form. For Pastor Bob himself, the legacy is quieter but no less profound. He never sought to be Elvis reborn. He never demanded attention or claimed the title. He simply kept preaching, kept singing, kept serving. And in that choice lies a lesson Elvis himself would have understood, that greatness isn't always measured by fame but by impact. Elvis spent his final years searching for meaning beyond the applause. Pastor Bob, whether he is Elvis or not, embodies what that meaning might have looked like. The legacy also speaks to something uniquely human, the need for hope, the belief that our heroes can still walk among us. In a world so often filled with disappointment, the possibility that Elvis Presley might still be alive, even if only in another man's voice, is enough to make people feel that miracles are possible. And sometimes that belief is more powerful than the truth itself. It also reshapes how we view Elvis's own story. Too often his life is reduced to the excess, the decline, the tragedy. But when people see Pastor Bob Joyce, they don't think of prescription bottles or tabloid covers. They think of gospel, of kindness, of redemption. They think of Elvis as he wanted to be remembered, not just as a rock and roll star, but as a man of deep faith whose heart belonged to the music of the church. That is the echo that continues to resonate today. That is the version of Elvis people want to keep alive. And through Pastor Bob, whether by divine coincidence or something more, that version endures. The legacy extends beyond Elvis himself. It forces us to ask bigger questions about identity, about the line between myth and reality. It asks whether it matters if the man on stage is Elvis Presley or not, or if what matters is the way he makes us feel. It asks whether legends ever really die, or if they simply evolve, finding new vessels to carry their light. One fan put it this way: maybe Bob Joyce isn't Elvis, but when he sings, I feel Elvis again, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what Elvis would have wanted, for us to feel him, not just remember him. Another fan, a lifelong skeptic, admitted, I don't believe he's Elvis, but I'll tell you this, when he sang, I cried, and I haven't cried over Elvis since 1977. In the end, perhaps the true legacy isn't about proving or disproving anything. Perhaps it's about the mystery itself, the way it draws us in, the way it forces us to reflect, the way it makes us feel. Because mystery has power. It keeps us searching, keeps us questioning, keeps us alive to possibilities larger than ourselves. Elvis Presley may have left the stage in 1977, but through Pastor Bob Joyce, his spirit continues to perform, not under spotlights or in stadiums, but in the quiet corners of faith and memory. And that is a performance that may outlast even the King's most famous songs. So what does this moment mean today? It means Elvis's story is still being written. It means his voice still echoes, not just in vinyl grooves or digital streams, but in the living breath of another man. It means that legends, when they are loved enough, refuse to die. And maybe that's the final lesson. Elvis Presley was always more than a man. He was a symbol of hope, of love, of struggle, of redemption. Pastor Bob Joyce, whether he is Elvis or not, has become the keeper of that symbol. And every time he sings, the world is reminded of something we should never forget, that greatness is not just about fame or talent, but about the way a single voice can move millions. They placed Elvis beside Pastor Bob Joyce, and in doing so, they revealed a truth larger than either man. That legends live on, not because they never die, but because we refuse to let them. And as long as voices rise, as long as songs are sung, as long as faith endures, Elvis Presley's legacy will never fade. The story of Elvis Presley beside Pastor Bob Joyce doesn't end in proof or in certainty. It ends in something far more powerful, wonder. For decades, the world has demanded answers. Did Elvis really die in 1977? Could he have returned quietly in the voice and life of a humble pastor? Or is Pastor Bob Joyce simply a man whose extraordinary resemblance has become the vessel for our collective longing? The truth may never be spoken, and perhaps that is the point. Because what this story reveals is not just about Elvis or Bob Joyce or even the mystery between them. It's about us, about why we cling to legends, about why we chase echoes of voices long gone, about why we need to believe that the ones who touched our souls most deeply never really leave us. When the world placed Elvis beside Pastor Bob Joyce, something rare happened. For a moment, history and the present collided. People who had wept at Elvis's grave found themselves crying again, not in grief this time, but in awe. People who had never known him alive felt as though they had. And people who had doubted for decades suddenly questioned everything they thought they knew. That is the power of legacy. That is the power of mystery. That is the power of a single voice that refuses to fade. As the years pass, the debates will continue. Some will argue until their dying breath that Pastor Bob Joyce is Elvis Presley, reborn in faith. Others will insist it's all coincidence, nothing more. But neither side can deny what happened when those two names were placed together. Neither side can deny the electricity that surged through that congregation or the ripple effect it sent around the world. And maybe that's the lesson Elvis himself would have wanted us to learn, that the point isn't about proving identities or winning arguments. The point is about the way music, faith, and hope can transform us, the way a song can bridge generations, the way a single moment can remind us that legends don't die when their bodies do. They live on in the hearts of those who refuse to stop listening. Think about it, Elvis Presley's career was built not just on records or concerts, but on connection. Millions of people felt they knew him even if they never met him. Millions felt his voice spoke directly to them even if they sat in the back row of a stadium. That connection didn't vanish in 1977. It lives on every time someone presses play on his music, or whispers his name, or feels a shiver run down their spine when Pastor Bob Joyce sings a hymn. And so, the real legacy of that moment isn't about uncovering a secret, it's about rediscovering a truth. That Elvis Presley's gift, his voice, his spirit, his ability to move people was never about one man, it was about all of us. It was about how we feel when we hear him. It was about how we remember who we are through his music. When Pastor Bob Joyce sings, people don't just hear a man, they hear memory. They hear love, they hear possibility. And whether or not he is Elvis Presley, he becomes the echo of a legend who still refuses to leave. Maybe that is why people were stunned when Elvis was placed beside Pastor Bob Joyce. Not because it solved a mystery, but because it reminded us that some mysteries don't need solving. Some mysteries exist to keep us searching, to keep us believing, to keep us alive to wonder. So perhaps the question isn't, is Bob Joyce really Elvis? Perhaps the question is, why does this story move us so deeply? And the answer is simple, because it touches something eternal inside us, the part of us that longs for connection, the part of us that aches to believe in miracles, the part of us that refuses to let go of the ones who shaped us. That is why this story matters. That is why it will continue to matter long after the debates have quieted and the voices have faded. Because Elvis Presley's story didn't end in 1977. It lives on in songs, in memories, in faith, and yes, perhaps even in the sermons of a pastor from Arkansas. And as you sit here listening to this story, you are part of that legacy. You are proof that Elvis Presley never really left. Because you still care, you still wonder, you still feel. They placed Elvis beside Pastor Bob Joyce, and what the world saw wasn't just a man or a pastor or a legend. What the world saw was itself, longing for meaning, desperate for hope, aching for connection. And maybe that is the final gift Elvis gave us. Not a certainty, but a question, not a goodbye, but an echo. Not an ending, but a reminder that legends never die, not when they still have the power to make us believe. So what will you believe? Will you see coincidence or miracle? Will you dismiss it as fantasy or embrace it as mystery? Will you argue over facts or let yourself feel the wonder of it all? The choice in the end is yours. But no matter what you decide, one truth remains. Elvis Presley's voice still lives, his spirit still moves, his legacy still stuns the world. And maybe that's all that matters. Because legends don't need to be explained, they just need to be remembered. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or wonder, don't let it end here. Carry it forward, share it, talk about it. Keep the conversation alive, because in keeping the story alive, you keep Elvis alive too. And if you want more untold stories like this, stories of legends, mysteries, and the echoes of voices we can't forget, then make sure you're part of this journey with us. Subscribe, join our community, and stay with us for the next chapter because the king's story isn't finished yet. There's still more to tell.